Hello everybody. In this lesson, we'll be looking at the literary criticism in the age of the English Romantics, 1798 to 1832. Several of these concepts you have already encountered as we discussed the preface to the Lyrical, Ballads and Coleridge's Biographia, Literaria. So there might be a bit of overlap and repetition from earlier lessons, so please bear with me on this. The Romantic age saw the publishing of major essays and works of criticism. This includes the famous preface to the Lyrical Ballads, William Wordsworth and Coleridge's collection, Coleridge's Biographia, Literaria, monumental work, Percy Shelley's A Defense of Poetry. There were also the various lectures that Samuel Coleridge gave at various places and now available in compiled form. Formulations of the ideas of the imagination, specific aesthetic ideals have figured in all these texts. We'll take it in one by one. In the preface to the Lyrical Ballads, Wordsworth argued for the subject and language of new poetry. He said that the language and subject of new poetry must be rooted in the rustic life of England. And that's your first slide. We have seen this before, so perhaps you could read it again and refresh your minds about what it actually says. He said in the preface, the principal object was to choose incidents and situations from common life and to relate or describe them throughout as far as possible in the language used by men. To, that is, use the language of the common person. Why? It is essential because, as he puts it, the manners of rural life germinate from those elementary feelings, and from the necessary character of rural occupations are more easily comprehended and more durable. The essential passions, he says, and I'm quoting here from the slide, the essential passions of the heart find a better soil in which they can attain their maturity. By this he means that the rustics are more genuine, within quotes. Quotes are, of course, from our presentist position. Wordsworth believes that it's in the rustic life, in the rustic people, that there are more genuine emotions. In rural conditions, men speak, he believed, from their own personal experience. They convey whatever they have to convey in simple, unelaborated expressions, as he put it. He went on to claim that the subject and content from rustic subjects had to be modified, purified is the word he used, by the poetic mind to make them poetry. That is, it was not enough to just adopt the language of the rustic people. You have to adapt it. Here is Wordsworth on slide 2 on the definition of poetry. This is again preface to the Lyrical Ballads. His famous definition: poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origins from emotion recollected in tranquility. And then he qualifies this a little bit. The emotion is contemplated till by a species of reaction the tranquility gradually disappears, and an emotion kindred to that which was before the subject of contemplation is gradually produced and does itself actually exist in the mind. Note the emphasis on contemplation. Wordsworth is not proposing emotions as they are. He's talking about emotions as recollected, modified, contemplated, rationalized. In other words, he's seeking an intellectualization of emotion. Coming up on your next slide is Wordsworth on diction. He says, this is again preface to the Lyrical Ballads, my purpose was to imitate and, as far as possible, to adopt the very language of men. He then goes on. The language of such poetry as is here recommended is, as far as possible, a selection of the language really spoken by men. That this selection, wherever it is made with true taste and feeling, will of itself form a distinction far greater than would at first be imagined. He also claimed that this language should be closer to the language of prose. I quote again, that not only the language of a large portion of every good poem, even of the most elevated character, must necessarily, except with reference to the meter, in no respect differ from that of good prose. In other words, Wordsworth is actually claiming, and this seems a bit startling, that the language of good poetry must be very close to, and as he puts it, no respect differ from the language of good prose. But likewise, that some of the most interesting parts of the best poems will be found to be strictly in the language of prose, when prose is well written. Modifying this kind of definition is Wordsworth coming up again on slide 4. The slide repeats an excerpt before, but it's worth taking a look at for what he's doing here. Please understand, the intellectualization of emotion merges with what we have just said here, the language of prose. That is, he is speaking about diction which captures emotion but delivers it in a particular way. Wordsworth, please note, is not speaking about emotions just spontaneously overflowing. He's speaking about regulated emotions. Emotions that have been intellectualized, modified, and cast into the language of good prose. Building on this, Wordsworth would offer a provisional definition of the poet as well. And this is also something we have seen before, but coming up on your slide, the excerpt from the preface to the Lyrical Ballads, where he says, a poet addresses other people. He is a man speaking to men. In the course of this series of definitions of poetry, of poetic diction, of the poetic subject, and here of the nature of the poet itself, Wordsworth, as we have argued before, is trying to build an audience for the kind of poetry they are writing. It's not, of course, an easy task, and as you can see, there is a defense constantly of the kind of poetry that these people are writing. As noted in earlier lessons, Wordsworth is trying to develop a public taste for poetry. Coleridge's task is slightly different. In Biographia Literaria and the criticism encoded in there, Biographia Literaria as a genre itself is, as a volume, as a piece of work itself, is a bit of a mixed genre. It is autobiographical, philosophical, religious, and critical. A lot of it, we now know, was written as a response to Wordsworth's preface, which they were supposed to have co-authored, where Coleridge thought Wordsworth had altered what they had decided on the craft of poetry. In fact, critics now see Biographia Literaria as Coleridge's preface to his own poetry. The key sections in the 4-volume Biographia Literaria are as follows. In the first volume, Coleridge discusses form and perceptions, which he would identify as a primary imagination. In the second volume, he would demonstrate how these perceptions and images are transformed in poetry, which he will explain as the secondary imagination. This secondary imagination for Coleridge is the poetic imagination. There is also the famous Coleridge distinction between fancy and imagination. Put together, these ideas and concepts have been the centerpiece of Romantic criticism and its legacies. Coleridge believes Wordsworth's 1800 preface emphasized too much on the language of the rustic. They appear to be fundamentally different in terms of their views of language itself. Coleridge defined poetry in this fashion, coming up on your slide. The art of representing external nature and human thoughts and affections, both relatively to human affections, to the production of as great immediate pleasure in each part as is compatible with the largest possible sum of pleasure in the whole. Poetry is a species of composition, opposed to science as having intellectual pleasure for its object and attaining its end by the language natural to us in states of excitement. For Coleridge, art is not a copy, but an imitation of nature. It does not aim to be reality, but represent reality. Then comes his famous definition and distinction between fancy and imagination. Coming up on your next 2 slides, please look at what Coleridge is saying here. We have looked at this slide before in other lessons. Here is the distinction between the primary imagination and the secondary one. The primary imagination is a repetition of the finite mind. The secondary imagination is an echo, but what does it do? And here, 4-5 lines down on your slide's text is the key argument. The secondary imagination dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate, or where this process is rendered impossible, yet at all events it struggles to idealize. Fancy has no other counters to play with but fixities and definites. Fancy operates by choice between already present objects and images, but the secondary imagination acts with the co-presence and control of the conscious will. Fancy, therefore, is rather limited, Coleridge argued, to the reorganization and recombination of already existing separate sense impressions. It's rather mechanical. For Coleridge, secondary imagination is the key. Secondary imagination is also not common. It's the mark of the artistic genius which dissolves, dissipates in order to recreate, as he called it. He called this process of the secondary imagination esemplastic, the process by which it can shape into one and to convey something new. Coleridge also classified readers. Coming up on your slide is Coleridge's classification of readers, of which he found 4. Sponges, and there's a certain amount of savage irony here. Sponges that suck up everything and when pressed give it out in the same state, only perhaps somewhat dirtier. Sand glasses, the second type of reader, is the sand glass, or rather the upper half of the sand glass, which is in a brief hour likely to be empty. As he puts it, in a brief hour assuredly lets out what it has received, whose reading is only a profitless measurement and dozing away of time. Then there are the straining bags, who get rid of whatever is good and pure and retain the dregs. As in readers who, after they read, do not retain the good things. They throw out the good things and keep the useless things. Finally, the great moguls, diamond sieves, which is perhaps going farther for a simile than its superior dignity can repay. These are the 4 varieties. There are also, in Shelley, the classification of poets as philosophers, and again this is something we have looked at. Shelley, in a defense of poetry, argued that poetry subsumed into itself all other forms of thought. That is, poetry is this largest category into which philosophy also fits. Poetry includes morality as well, and this is the extended quotation from Percy Shelley's A Defense of Poetry. A poet essentially comprises and unites both these characters. What are those? Legislators and prophets. As in, the poet is a bit of everything. A poet participates in the eternal, the infinite, and the one, as far as it relates to his conceptions, time and place and number. The poet is above all else something that transcends the social. So for Shelley, the poet is not a man speaking to men, as Coleridge said. He is not somebody who just imagines and brings everything together in an essemplastic creation, as Coleridge said. No, for Shelley, the poet is a prophet. And what Shelley does throughout his preface to poetry and his poem Ode to the West Wind is to say that we need to listen to these poets. So as you can see, we have seen a range of ideas about poets, poetry, poetic diction, and the connection between the poet and the social order. Wordsworth's argument was that poets are men speaking to other men, and the poetic diction must be close to the language of the rustics, but they must be modified. Coleridge distinguished between fancy and imagination, and the secondary imagination, which dissipates, dissolves, and recreates, is the key. Shelley moves it out of this debate entirely to say that the poet is an unacknowledged legislator of mankind, and our job ought to be to listen to these poets as prophets. Thank you.